Welcome to See You on the Other Side, where the world of the mysterious collides with the world of entertainment. A discussion of art, music, movies, spirituality, the weird, and self-discovery. And now, your hosts, musicians and entertainers who have their own weakness for the weird, Mike and Wendy from the band Sunspot.
Episode 279. Ram Dass, Psychedelics, and the mystical world of Richard Alpert. How are you guys doing today? We got Allison from Milwaukee Ghosts, and of course, Wendy.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
Happy New Year. Doing great. It's 2020, yo.
Yeah, it's our first weird discussion.
Unbelievable. I remember when I thought 2000 or 1999 would be something. Now it's 2020. Yeah. What happened?
When we're talking about the topic this week, I was thinking about that specific kind of thing in the passage of time. So today we're talking about the psychedelic explorer and New Age philosopher guru Ram Dass, whose birth name was Richard Alpert, born in 1931 to a Jewish family in Massachusetts. And he eventually became very famous for a couple of things. Number one, he was part of the LSD research at Harvard in the early 1960s. And then he wrote a book called Be Here Now in the 1970s, where he synthesized Indian and Buddhist spirituality, along with Christianity, Judaism, taking a little bit of the Gospels and the Scriptures and all that kind of stuff in the Old Testament, mashing it all together into like a Unitarian kind of New Age mysticism / spirituality.
It's a big God smoothie. Just say it.
It's a big God smoothie.
I hope you have your glass straws, everyone, because we've got a big God smoothie for you.
Well, and so he died December 22nd, age 88. He had lived the past 30 years in Maui, Hawaii. And so got to enjoy paradise for a good portion of that life.
Yeah, that's a very good portion of your life.
Yeah, it's easy to be a Buddhist when you're staring at the beautiful mountains or the beaches of Maui.
But also, though, is it easy to be a Buddhist when half your body is paralyzed and you can hardly speak, as what happened to him after his stroke in 1997? So the good also comes with the bad.
Very deep, Mike.
Well, I just mean the reason I was thinking about time passing, though, is because from in the 1960s when they were doing this LSD research at Harvard. So we just go back and real quick. So he was a psychotherapist who was also taking psychotherapy himself, and he was always someone who felt that his traditional religion, because he was raised, fairly secular Jewish, he didn't feel fulfilled by the spirituality that he was getting. And so he thought, well, maybe I'll learn more in psychotherapy. He talks about this in his book, Be Here Now. And so in the middle, he was taking psychotherapy. So he was, not only was he, a member of the Psychotherapy Club for Men, he also was a psychotherapist himself. And so he was really unfulfilled by those things. And he said that when they started taking LSD and psilocybin, in magic mushrooms, that he started to have these spiritual experiences that he'd been craving all of his life.
Yeah, and we are really seeing a psychedelic renaissance right now. In the 50s, and then a little bit later, before the war on drugs was announced, there was, tremendous research into psychedelics for psychiatric use. And huge breakthroughs were achieved. But then something happened that shut it all down, and we'll have to talk about that a little bit later. But thankfully now, things seem to be opening up again. And we can look at these substances with a clearer view and see that, they are something that can really help us at this time when we really need to reconnect with the planet.
Well, yeah. The thing is, hippies, man, like they've got a lot of good ideas, but the fashion and the music just never got me. Oh man, because the thing is, I get it. You're all high, and a guitar solo goes on for 20 minutes, but the guy's just noodling on a pentatonic scale. It's not even that interesting. I guess it's a meditative way. 20 minutes of Jerry Garcia farting out a guitar solo. But the thing is that what I really like about the hippies is that they were searching for a spiritual experience, and you think about that generation. They were looking for something deeper. They didn't deny spirituality. They said that they wanted to have a deeper relationship with it. And when I think about the time between 1969 and 1989 and the beginning of the New Age movement, but you also have books like Be Here Now that affected a lot of people. And you had psychedelic explorers and people who were interested in learning more about the human relationship with the divine. There was a golden age of it. And then when you think about 1999 to 2019, have we had a golden age or just a bunch of Silicon Valley people that like to get a little extra high?
And can afford to go to South America and do their little trips.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
ayahuasca party.
And I mean, that's the kind of thing, that needs further discussion. But, I think, the hippie gurus, I mean, they were doing it too. Ram Dass or Richard Alpert himself, I mean, he was able to go to India to have his, spiritual experience. I mean, who can afford the plane tickets back and forth, not to mention weeks and weeks where you don't have a job. You're just like hanging around trying to find yourself and reach your.
He was a Harvard professor. You assume that he was able to save some money. And a psychotherapist is expensive now. It's expensive then.
Right.
So, I mean, but the thing is, the stuff that those guys did, that Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary did, some of their research was very interesting. In fact, they once tried to do research with J.B. Ryan himself, the man behind, him and his wife were behind the Duke Ryan Laboratory on ESP and paranormal research. And so J.B. Ryan went to Harvard from North Carolina, where Duke is. So he goes up to Boston to try to do some ESP research with Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. And so they all take some LSD for a couple of days, and they start, they think they're going to have this serious ESP research, but then none of the results are usable because they couldn't stop laughing the whole time.
That's embarrassing.
So, yeah. So
Side
the whole
effect.
thing is, yeah. Because the thing is, there was this group of people. So Aldous Huxley is in there. He's, he's one of the founders. Aldous Huxley, he's the guy that wrote Brave New World.
And the Doors
book.
of Perception.
Yeah, and the band The Doors is named after Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception. I mean, LSD is the drugs in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And, that's what they're talking about, is that this mind expansion that comes from what happens with a psychedelic. And so when they have this Harvard psilocybin project, and funny thing is, when they first go out to try to, discover the source of psilocybin, because LSD, I think we talked about this in an earlier episode, LSD is synthesized in the 1930s by Albert Hofmann, on accident almost. And so then, if they're looking for a natural, where does this stuff kind of come from naturally? And they hear about magic mushrooms in Mexico. And so now here's the thing where you can say that Richard Alpert was a rich guy, was a rich, privileged man. He did have his own plane.
What?
So he was a pilot and he had his own Cessna.
He had a Cessna?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And so his father was the president of the New Haven Railroad. So it's not like he did. I mean, he grew up in a well-to-do family, and so he did have this. But I don't think that makes his message any less potent just because he had his own plane.
Well,
You know?
I'm not saying that. I mean, his message was appropriated from others, and I think that you can get the message from him or many other people. And where should you spend your money? Maybe not on a book that he wrote, because he's got enough money. So that message is powerful. But I think there's other gurus out there that definitely deserve your money more.
See, I completely disagree because I tried to listen to other gurus talk, and they're not as interesting. His stories, he was a good storyteller. His lectures are interesting. So what connects with me? Like, okay, have you ever read the Eckhart Tolle book?
Yes.
Wendy, what's the big Eckhart Tolle book?
Something in the now. Wait. The Power of...
It's not. It's like Be Here Now.
The power of now.
Is it The Power of Now? Yeah. I mean, Eckhart Tolle, obviously, his writing's pretty good, but you hear him talk. It's The Power of Now is the Eckhart Tolle book. And you hear Eckhart Tolle talk, and it's like listening to Yoda. It's like listening to...
It sounds like a Muppet.
I have an 8-hour lecture from Eckhart Tolle that I made it about halfway through, and I'm like, that's it. I can't take this guy seriously.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing is like you have to be what works for Richard Alpert, I think, was that he was a great medium for this message because he could impart it to the hippies in the 1970s in a way that maybe somebody who was not familiar with the American audience could.
Yeah, I mean, he did serve as a bridge, between that culture and our own. I mean, it might have been a problematic bridge, but, I can agree that, certainly he reached out to another culture and he was able to deliver the goods that they have to give.
And if you read Be Here Now, I think you see that he there's the Buddha, and then there's something from the gospel, and then there's something from Madame Blavatsky. So, you have all of these things kind of brought together in a way that is synthesized in a new direction. And so that's where I think that spiritually he could be the most interesting, because when you read the book, he's quoting Jesus, and then he quotes the Buddha, and then he jumps to somebody else, and then he jumps to somebody else in a way that I think a Western audience can now feel like, okay, I get this story now because you compared it to something I had in Sunday school.
Yeah.
And I think that
no question.
That's important. And he anyway, but we'll get there because I want to talk more about the Harvard psilocybin project because it makes me wish I went to school between 1960 and 1962 and had these cool of professors. So the thing is, when they're so Richard Alpert wants to take his plane that he's going to fly himself, and in his book he talks about it he didn't know how to fly that well yet. But Timothy Leary's like, we're going to go down to Mexico in a few months, and we're going to find this psilocybin with this other guy, Greg Wasson, I think
Gordon
is his name.
Wasson.
Gordon Wasson.
Yeah, so Gordon Wasson did write a whole article for, I believe it was Life magazine, which was really, life-changing for many, but he wrote it about magic mushrooms. And unfortunately, though, the people that he was with in Mexico, they really, really regretted turning him on to the mushrooms, and they thought that he actually effectively, killed the power of the mushrooms. So I know we were talking off air. I was talking with Wendy about Ram Dass and how he went to India and then he appropriates all this knowledge. And what did the people in India say to him?
Oh,
when they told him?
Well, he said that he went there and they said, this is sacred knowledge. Don't share it with anybody. And then he came back and shared it with everybody. But his rationale was that he felt that it was his knowledge now and he had to share it. And that was what he, as an individual,
Right, absolutely.
felt was his, just, his soul was urging him to do. So,
But also, like, some of these things are they don't, like, you don't own knowledge, you don't own spirituality, you can't copyright it.
no, you can't. But I mean,
is there? Well, I agree. Like, he may have, like, if he made a promise, then he betrayed it. But at the same time, the idea that the people in America should not be exposed to psilocybin, and maybe to its life-changing healing effects, or let's call it psilocybin instead of magic mushrooms, because every time we say that, I just feel like we sound like we're talking like drug dealers. And that's my whole problem with the hippies, is that it's like, it's awesome when you're looking for a spiritual experience, but so much of it kind of boiled over into hedonism, which there's nothing wrong with that, I guess. But when you go into and I think Ram Dass and Richard Alpert was as much of a perpetrator that as anybody in the hedonism aspect of it, because he was just like, well, we got high, and we got high, we wanted to stay high.
yeah, right.
All the time. And, it just, when you say you're looking for a religious experience, but at this, but you're just partying, I guess, or whatever, it kind of takes away some of the, like, is it really a spiritual experience, or are you just someone who wants to feel high all the time?
Yeah, there's a difference.
And, right. And so, you think like, well, maybe they wanted to do a little bit of both. But they were studying, and I had never heard this particular term before, entheogenic substances.
Oh, yes. Entheogens.
And so, I mean, that makes sense because theism, God, and entheogenic substances are substances you take in order to have a spiritual experience. And that's going to be peyote or ayahuasca or LSD, man.
So, okay, let's get back to your story, because I want to hear about the plane trip to Mexico. I just wanted to insert this here that so Gordon Wasson, he's the one who originally went down to Mexico to, discover the psilocybin mushrooms. Discover, there's that word again. To appropriate magic mushrooms from, that shamanic culture there. And so, and I know about it because of a Milwaukee connection. We have the Milwaukee Public Library here, or I'm sorry, the library is on it too, but the Milwaukee Public Museum is the one I need to mention right now. And its director, former director, haunts it, and his name is Stefan Borhage, and he was very into mushrooms as well, and he actually was in contact with Gordon Wasson. They shared lots of research, and in the Gordon Wasson archive, there's lots of letters, like hundreds of letters between Borhage and Gordon Wasson about this mushroom research. So I'm definitely going to want to delve into that soon. But so Gordon Wasson went down there, and he met this Mexican shaman named Maria Sabina. And she shared with him their sacred rituals of the mushroom. But then he would write this big expose in Life magazine, and then people from America and all over wouldn't stop coming to Mexico and to discover the mushroom. And, it just became too much. And she actually said, before Wasson, nobody took the children, that's what she calls the mushrooms, simply to find God. They were always taken to cure the sick. And she felt that with what they were doing, they were actually killing the children, and they weren't being used in the way that they were intended.
Poor little mushroomy children.
Sure. Yeah, poor little mushroomy children. I mean, the thing is, that chick's high too.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
Like, let's talk about it. All these people are high, and they're talking, and they're taking shrooms, and some people are going to be special about it, or they're going to be protective of it, and other people are going to like, this experience should go to others. But also, we are dealing with everybody taking drugs. And speaking of somebody that went on that plane with Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary was Arthur Kessler, the author, who was he's the guy that he died, and he left all the royalties and all of his fortune to the Kessler Parapsychology Unit in Edinburgh, Scotland. So, like, the last place you can be, you can get like a degree in parapsychology in the world left, because the damn atheists have made it so we can't have parapsychology degrees at regular universities. That's Arthur Kessler, and shrooms did not do well by him.
Yeah.
While Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were tripping holy balls.
Okay.
Arthur Kessler just got sick.
Aww.
So the poor guy didn't even get to have a good trip, man.
Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, that's a monumental thing that came out of it. The chair over at Edinburgh University, that's where you can become the last Jedi. I mean, that's
right,
the
true.
way I look at it, that's the place where you go to receive the sacred knowledge. I mean, I'm opening up here and telling, like my deepest feelings about it and kind of making fun of it at the same time. But I do think that, that was, something huge that, maybe came out of some of these experiences. And there's good and bad that came out of it, of course. And interestingly, his experience of just getting sick on the mushrooms maybe speaks to his mental state, because he really suffered mightily and terribly from depression. And it's interesting now, like Maria Sabina said that the children were taken to cure the sick. And now we seem to be getting back to that in our modern age. So I'm hoping that things will turn around, and the way these mushrooms help turn us around is by maybe curing our modern epidemic of depression.
Well, and this is going to sound not a little weird, but I do think that part of our modern epidemic of mental illness is the gap between maybe how people used to have more spirituality in their lives, and now it's replaced by what?
Yeah.
Video games? I mean, I don't know. What do you worship now? Or not even worship, but how do you feel close to nature or close to the planet or close? That was a good thing about it. I mean, the hippies had some really good ideas. They just couldn't play guitar. And tie-dye, it just, I don't know, man.
Wait
I know,
a second.
Allison, you'll fight me to death on that.
I know. I wear tie-dye like
You're probably
almost
wearing
every day.
You're wearing
I
a
was
tie-dye
wearing-
shirt right now,
I'm
man.
not, but I was wearing one earlier. I wear one every day when I teach in China over the internet. But anyway, I gotta say that. Oh, what did I have to say? I had to say something. Oh, Jimi Hendrix. Now that man could play guitar.
I don't. Okay, you're right. I guess I don't think of him as much of a hippie.
Oh my God, he was at Woodstock.
Ever see those pants he wore?
But
He was a hippie, so there's your exception.
You're okay. You know what? I'm gonna take that back. I just keep thinking of jam bands. That is my
Okay,
bad.
right.
And I could be poisoned by hundreds of gigs that Wendy and I have been. Jam bands appropriated music from the '60s, and now they use it horribly, inflicting it all on us at shows. So the thing is, though. The idea that using this as a shortcut to a spiritual experience may not be the healthiest thing in the world, but it also showed Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert and Aldous Huxley particularly, that these things that spiritual experiences were real, where in the past you might have had to meditate forever, do the rosary for hours on end kind of thing, to have that religious kind of ecstasy. This was a way to shortcut yourself to it And I think it showed them that these things were possible. And so they had this thing, Good Friday experiments. Good Friday, 1962.
Yes, at the Mars Chapel. I love that experiment.
Yeah. And so a graduate student in theology at Harvard Divinity School, he designs the experiment.
Walter Mankey, right?
Yeah, and he wants to see whether psilocybin would act as an entheogen in religiously predisposed subjects. So, can you have a religious experience while you're on psilocybin if you're a Christian or something like that? So he gets 20 graduate degree divinity student volunteers from Boston. He gets them in 2 groups, double blind. Half the students receive psilocybin, while the other half receive niacin. So imagine getting the niacin. You're like, oh man. That's like eating total for breakfast. That's your part of the experiment.
You might get a little hot. That's about it.
Right. So, but the thing is, it was an active placebo. So niacin produces some physiological changes. So it's an active placebo. But like you said, getting a little hot. Mm-hmm. So that's what happens when they took this niacin. So then you might feel flush or something. So almost all the members of the experimental group reported experiencing profound religious experiences, providing the empirical support that psychedelic drugs can facilitate those.
Yeah, and let me just interject. I read something about it recently, and now, because it was written by the guy who, wasn't sure at the time, that he wanted to commit to this was a meaningful a meaningful experience with God. He didn't want to admit that wholeheartedly for whatever reason, but he's since come, so many years later and written about it and said, yes, so now everybody who took the psilocybin has had lasting changes from that one experience with psilocybin.
So I mean, that's what makes you think that these things are powerful, and that their research, could show us something about, mean that people are interested in having these kinds of experiences, whether they're through chemical substances or not. But, so what's happening in Harvard, and then Richard Alpert in his book, in Be Here Now, I mean, he goes and says that, he talks about like talking to one of his friends that like disappears off a couch when he's on LSD. He talks about taking LSD for like 3 weeks. It's him and like 2 other people in a house. And he goes, the stuff that happened there, you wouldn't believe. I wouldn't. He's like, I don't believe it. And he says that under LSD, people were able to read his mind. He was able to read other people's minds. That people were able to control his mind. I mean, that's also a sign of schizophrenia, which obviously we don't know necessarily how psychedelics can contribute to that. We know marijuana contributes to it if you're predisposed. But do psychedelic substances like LSD or psilocybin have the same effect? There's not enough research done on it yet. But he talks about the different psychic abilities that get unlocked when these guys experience ego death, which is the big thing about these psychedelic substances. It's not just that you're feeling mellow or whatever. It's that you feel the disillusion of the self. That you are no longer, I'm no longer Mike, you're no longer Allison, you're no longer Wendy, that we're all one consciousness, man. And that, we can communicate to each other without the physical restraints that the ego puts on us.
That's right. And it's now been called the default mode network. And this is a reason, too, that it's been used to help people with depression, for example, because it stops that tyranny of the ego, of the default mode network, and lets you get into the nitty-gritty of what's gone wrong.
And so, but the thing is, I mean, this idea of the mind control thing. I mean, the CIA, we've talked about this before in their MK Ultra experiments. The CIA thought that LSD could be a wonderful brainwashing tool in order to be able to get people to do what they wanted. And
Shane Moss, who has a great podcast and I would say he's a psychedelic. He's a psychedelic comedian. He says, that.
What does that mean? He just gets high and tells jokes?
Pretty much.
Just laughing at his own jokes.
Pretty much.
All right.
Well,
See, it's an easy
he gets
target.
high and then tells jokes about it. And in fact, he's got his own documentary on Amazon right now. But anyway, my point is that he said in one of his comedy bits, he talked about, he's like, so, everybody is using these drugs to get closer to God, and then the U.S. It gets the U.S. and we say, how can we weaponize it?
Right.
But can we kill people with it? So, the idea though is that it backfired. It really backfired on them.
Well, right. So the MK, they weren't able to use it for anything, useful or anything. But there was a group called I think it was called the Human Ecology Foundation. Yeah, I'm sorry, the Human Ecology Fund. And they were a CIA front organization that was sponsoring some parapsychological studies at Oxford in the late 1950s, where they were, using LSD or whatever for psychic experiments. And, then also they were, interested in what these guys were doing at Harvard. And so they actually were in communication with Arthur Kessler, and that they were kind of trying to use him to get into the Harvard psilocybin experiment and everything. So I thought that was interesting that it didn't even kind of the CIA also was there. They're like, hey, you guys are studying this. Great. Now, how can we get your research? How can we direct your research in the way of controlling minds to fight the Red Menace?
Yeah. But it's interesting how they wanted to use it to control people, but it like I said, it went entirely the other way. And, maybe that's part of what resulted in the war on drugs. Oh, no. You can't control people as easily if they've experienced psychedelics. But,
right.
The one thing that Terence McKenna got wrong is I think it was Terence McKenna, but it was, you're going to take this and, you can't get people to fight your wars, or you can't get people to be part of your corporations. But we know that Silicon Valley has embraced the power of psychedelics. So, that part kind of didn't go the way that the gurus thought it would.
Right. And but the thing is that it's not like, once they ended the Harvard psilocybin experiment, which eventually got ended by the diet guru, Andrew Weil.
Yes.
The holistic medicine guy.
Yes, he's on PBS all the time. With his lectures, and everybody acts like, he is a huge guru. But he wasn't so nice back then, was he?
He's a rat. Well, so it's not like Richard Alpert. He was already giving LSD to people he shouldn't have. He was already having sex with students and things like that. So we're not talking about, this guy's not a Mr. Innocence.
He's not a saint. So that's the thing. He did do valuable things. He's just not a saint. And he was giving psilocybin to undergraduates. That was the whole problem. There was a policy at Harvard where you can't do that. You can give it to graduate students, but not undergraduates. And if you were attractive enough, you could get psilocybin from Richard Alpert, but Andrew could not.
Ram Dass
were like, no, dude, sorry, we can't give it to undergraduates.
Ram Dass followed his magic mushroom around.
Oh, man.
And he did. But so then eventually, Andrew Weil is the guy that turns them in and says, look, they're giving LSD to undergraduates, and then Harvard shuts everything down. And so then Alpert and Timothy Leary go out to California for a while, where they try to keep some of the studies going. And, Timothy Leary eventually develops that turn on, tune in, drop out phrase in 1966. And so, funny enough, he says that the person that made up the phrase was Marshall McLuhan, the guy that gave us the medium is the message phrase. And so Marshall was just was really into marketing because he was a media study kind of guy. And he starts singing like a little song going, psychedelics hit the spot, 500 micrograms, that's a lot, to the tune of a Pepsi commercial. And then he goes, tune in, turn on, and drop out kind of thing. So Timothy Leary took that as in turn on means to go within to activate your neural and genetic equipment. Tune in means to interact harmoniously with the world around you. And drop out means to detach yourself from your unconscious commitments. And so drop out means like self-reliance and discovery of your own power.
Right.
And so
disconnecting you from governmental power.
And the thing is that Timothy Leary even said this in his autobiography. He said, unhappily, my exclamations of this sequence of personal development are often misinterpreted to mean get stoned and abandon all constructive activity. And because the thing is, it's not like these guys were like, we all know druggies and stoners, and some of them may be spiritual explorers. And the others are definitely not spiritual explorers. But when we're talking about Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, like no matter what we think of all of their ethical decisions and what they did,
they were definitely pushing the boundaries.
Right. They were at least, and that's the thing. That's what I admired about the hippie movement, that trying to reach the edge of human potential that I think is awesome. And that's what I was saying, like when you think about the 1960s and what that kind of thing could be like one of the very positive legacy of the counterculture movement. When we think of what is the legacy of the countercultural movement or the non-mainstream in the past 20 years, it's not exploring the edge of spirituality in that same kind of way. And so it made me almost nostalgic for something that you're always like, oh, I really wish we had hippies like that again, man.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I love that message, but, what happened as a result, and maybe as a result of, what the CIA found out too, that, it's actually gonna lessen your control, just like LSD lessens the control of a person's own ego. It's also going to detach people from governmental control. And this is what led to the war on drugs. And, there were people in these movements, in the hippie movement, and in civil rights that, were making major political and social changes and empowering these things. And so people like Nixon felt that they were a threat. And so he couldn't jail them for their beliefs and for the changes they were making. But if they were smoking reefer or if they were dropping acid, he could jail them for that and take them out of the picture. And that's really the reason for the war on drugs, because he was uncomfortable with these political and social changes, and the only way he could do it is make these drugs illegal, and then he can put these people, these political prisoners, essentially, in jail for drug crimes.
Well, I mean, he did what Lyndon Johnson didn't figure out. So Lyndon Johnson just gave up and didn't run in 1968 because he couldn't take on the hippies. There was the riots, the Chicago Democratic Convention, there was all that kind of stuff. And so Lyndon Johnson did not know how to take on the counterculture because he didn't realize that we don't have to attack them, we can just attack what they've got. And they got LSD? Well, we'll make LSD a Schedule I drug so that we can then start arresting the hippies. And so while the war on drugs ended up being horrible for the United States of America, it was a fairly shrewd political maneuver in 1970.
Definitely. But it was also terrible for psychology, and thankfully, hopefully we're coming out of that now, finally, after all these years.
We can't even get legal pot in Wisconsin, so it's going to be a while. But the thing but the thing is, okay, I know we focused a lot on LSD because that's a lot of where the psychic stuff comes from with Ram Dass and Richard Alpert. But I want to get to the fact that he, later in life, and as he went to India in the late 1960s, and he meets the Hindu holy man, Neem Karoli Baba. He's the guy that changed his name from Richard Alpert to Ram Dass. His followers called him Maharaji. And it was him that also got him to change his mind about LSD even. So that he goes out to India, spends a long time there, meets this teacher, and then the Maharaji seems to know that the previous night he was thinking about his mother, and he even says to him, "Your mother died of a spleen disease. And she died a few months ago." And in his book, he talks about, and he talks about what was it that he was under the stars. He's outside going to the bathroom. He looks up at the stars and he feels his mother's presence there. He's thinking about her. He feels her presence like a ghost. And he feels overcome with love for his mother, like she's there with him. He talks about this in Be Here Now. And then he goes to bed. And he has this powerful experience of that he thought that he had a visitation with his mother. And then the next day, he meets the Maharaj and he goes, "Your mother came to you last night. She died of a spleen disease 6 months ago." And so that's like meeting John Edward or Chip Coffey or whatever and having them say that to you. And then all of a sudden you're like, "Chip Coffey, I believe in your magic scarf."
That's right. It's all real.
So this is what changes him to like, okay, this guy knows something about me that no one else could have possibly known. Then what happens is that he's got LSD with him all the time. I mean, he said that most of the time they just were smoking cheap hashish. So they're all high all the time anyway. So let's not get away from this, that they're still smoking hash all the time. This is the 1960s. And he gives the Maharaji 900 micrograms of LSD. Which, I mean, if Marshall McLuhan thought that 500 hit the spot, 900 is really going to take you home. And he spends all day with the Maharaji, and nothing happens. Like the Maharaji's like, "Hey, man, like it's..." So he was...
I'm already in Nirvana.
Right. Ram Dass was like, this guy was so, in tune with spirituality and stuff and in tune with the oneness of everyone, that LSD didn't have any effect on him. In fact, the Maharaji told him, "Love is a much stronger drug."
Dude.
Man. I don't know, we're laughing about this stuff, but this is a powerful enough experience that it changed his life. So that he started wearing robes.
Like you do. I mean, when I laugh, it doesn't really mean disrespect. We can make fun of him. I think he'd be the first one it's part
to laugh at it.
The way I metabolize all of this.
Yeah, no, he does have a good sense of humor, or did have a good sense of humor about it though. In his lectures, he would even like poke fun at his own experiences and things and say like, "Yeah,
Right. Well, in Be Here Now, he talks about more of those experiences that happen that he would call psychic. And he says before he went to India, he had two categories for psychic experience. One was they happened to somebody else and they haven't happened to me, and they were terribly interesting, and we certainly had to keep an open mind about it. And that was his psychological approach. The other one was, "Man, I'm high on LSD. Who knows how it really is? After all, under the influence of a chemical, how do I know I'm not creating the whole thing?" Because he said he had experienced, the creation of total realities under certain chemicals. He said that he took a drug called JB318, which was when he was still researching at the university. He said he was sitting on the third floor of this building, and it seemed like nothing was happening to him. And into the room walks a girl from their community. She's got a pitcher of lemonade, and she goes, "Would I like some lemonade?" I said that should be great. and she poured the lemonade, and she poured it, and she kept pouring, and the lemonade went over the side of the glass and fell to the floor and went across the floor and up the wall and over the ceiling and down the wall and under my pants, and all of a sudden my pants were wet.
Oh,
And the
yes,
girl
that's why your
disappeared.
pants were
Man.
wet, because
So
of the
it kinda-
lemonade.
Okay, it kind of sounds like he wet his pants, but
Yeah, lemonade.
at the same time, he had this hallucination where, he felt, so that's the thing, is that he was saying up until when he thought about psychic experiences, that someone being able to read his mind or understand something that happened to him that there's no possible way they could have understood. I mean, how would the Maharaji know that his mother died of a spleen disease?
That was weird.
That's what amazed him. It's because the psychic experiences he had before, he thought that he could explain them away through the chemical interactions in his head. And so that's what I thought, was an interesting thing, is that he's starting to experience psychic and paranormal activity, but this time it's not through drugs. It's from people who don't need the drugs. And he even talks about in the 1970s that he got to a point where, like, the Maharaji told him that him and his group should no longer take LSD because the LSD, like, they weren't using it. He said that they weren't using it correctly. That you're not using it for spiritual experiences anymore. Now you're doing it just to get high.
And we're back to Maria Sabina. She said the self-same thing.
Well, what they said was that you're getting addicted to the experience and not the actual, you're getting addicted to experiencing the feeling and all that. That's what you're addicted to, not the drug itself or whatever, but still.
Well, and that's the thing.
It's not being addicted. It's not like you're deepening your experience further and further, which is what they were, I guess, trying to do. But the gurus or whatever told them, you're just becoming addicted to this experience rather than furthering.
Right. And you're just doing it for like giggles, for fun, rather than, for development. And I mean, today when it's used, like psilocybin is used in, several university studies now. And the experience itself is awesome, but that's not where the work occurs. The work occurs later when you're not high, when you can integrate the messages that you received from your experience.
Well, and that's one of the things too, is that we're talking about how these things can change neural pathways, and it's a shortcut, right? We're talking about the shortcuts to ecstatic experience. How can you be here now if you're always high? How can you be in the moment if you're always trying to get away from something? And he talks about that in the book, and he talks about that in different books. And that's where he, while he still says psychedelics have a place, he's not like senor psychedelic like he was for a long time, where these guys were living most of their lives inside their own heads and inside this ego death with this universal consciousness wherever, instead of actually living life on earth with everybody else. And I think that's one of the messages that you can take from these guys, that while there are gateways to these kind of experiences, we're also human, and we have all the things that humanity implies, and that's part of living here, is being human and not always living at this I hate to say stoned level, because it's
the different planes.
Yes.
Right? They say, there's all these different planes, and you're in them all at the same time, and being human is one of the planes. So that's part of as much as you can gain from jumping from this human experience into other planes and, whatever methods you use to do that, this in and of itself is also part of the experience. So don't overlook that, I guess.
And I think, that's a good way to put it. And when you talk about the planes, Wendy, that leads me to what Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary did, was that they were finding that when they read the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, they were saying that the stuff that they describe in the Tibetan Book of the Dead was much like what they were experiencing when they were taking LSD. And so the Book of the Dead is supposed to be this guide through consciousness after death, between when you die and when you come back on your next go-round. And so they were getting that through their ego death when their selves were dying.
Yes, but the bardo is an illusion.
Right. So, I mean, they even use I think the Beatles even quote the Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary Tibetan Book of the Dead in their song Tomorrow Never Knows. They use pieces of it in there. But what I think is interesting is that you have the Tibetan Book of the Dead. You have what these guys experienced in LSD. And now we find out, research has shown that when people die, a psychedelic chemical gets released into the brain and that's what people talk about in near-death experiences. That's one of the materialistic scientific explanations of it, because your brain is releasing a psychedelic chemical. But just think about that, though. Like, they're finding this, and this is interesting. It's not necessarily a discovery, but it is the synthesizing between science and religion of, okay, now we are ourselves, by giving ourselves these chemicals, now we're going through the same journey that is in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, written hundreds of years before, or even, about several hundred years before. And now, 50 years later, when people are doing research, they find that when people die, chemicals do get released in the brain that can induce these experiences. And so it's interesting that the Buddhists had kind of figured this out hundreds of years before, but they just didn't have our chemical language to put onto it.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's exciting, that things are coming full circle now, and we are realizing that there's scientific underpinnings to ancient wisdom. And how did they get there when they didn't have science?
Right.
That's a big question, and something that we need to appreciate, that there's other ways of knowing rather than science. And I think Richard Alpert, I mean, what he did was to bring some of those ideas to our Western culture. And I mean, that is a good thing that he did.
Well, and he did it in a way where he could take things that we understood, or that people have, it's already been part of the fabric of their life. So if he's talking to a Jewish person, he can give them stuff from the Old Testament. If he's talking to a Christian, he can give them stuff that Jesus said. I mean, and be here now. I mean, half of it is quotes from the Bible. Even when he talks about like how you're supposed to eat when you consecrate the food. He's like, well, we already do this sometimes when we say grace, but if you want to, here's a Sanskrit consecration that you can use as well. And he like brings it all together in a way that synthesizes religions around the world. And so I think that is something that he brought that was unique. And you had to be somebody who was well-versed in those kind of things, and had to be somebody who came from his background, went through what he did, and then went to India and stuff like that, and then came back to a sweet life in Hawaii until he gets paralyzed, to be able to tell us those stories. And also, like, I would have never heard about this stuff, and I probably wouldn't be that interested because I was interested in the stuff he did with Timothy Leary, because we all love Fringe. And, who's the guy from Fringe but Timothy? I mean, it's basically based on Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert.
That's right, Walter.
Walter Bell is completely based on those guys.
And Fringe was a great show. Like, if you don't know, you can binge it right now and you'll enjoy it.
Yes, Fringe is a lot of fun.
And it's Walter Bell I just love him. I love that character.
Right. He's a hero. But the thing is, unless I was interested in those people, I wouldn't have been interested in Ram Dass. And the first time I heard about Ram Dass was probably because I liked Dr. Wayne Dyer.
Yeah, that's where I heard about him first.
Yeah. And Dr. Wayne Dyer is a guy that I liked him because number one, he had a doctorate. He wasn't so the thing is, if somebody's like a guru or a mystic, I'm going to be like, what the hell? I'm just not going to, but if somebody at least has like, okay, they put in enough work to get
because of your cultural.
Yes, I am biased. If you put in enough work to get a piece of paper from somewhere that takes 10 years, then you have a better chance of me listening to you than somebody who's just like, man, I know a lot of holy stuff. And so Dr. Wayne Dyer, I'd listen because I thought that he had a lot of nice things to say. And I mean, even Dad, the guy who's about as anti-mystical as you can get.
I don't think so.
He had a copy of Your Erroneous Zones that he bought when it came out.
Nice.
Maybe he just misread it. But yeah, I mean, I think our father is really spiritual. Like that time he just discovered crop circles, like 10 years on. And I was like,
they're all real.
About these things called crop circles?
That was the best. Like, what? Where you been? Anyway.
Welcome to the party.
So the thing is,
Right.
I think there's a lot of interesting implications in Ram Dass's work. And so much of it was based on dying. Like he had spent a good portion of his life trying to help people that were in the process of dying. He talks about that in Be Here Now a little bit, but he also just talks about that in some of his lectures where he says, we are so sheltered from death, and that's not a particularly healthy way to be. And so he would try to create communities for people that were dying in order to make them feel comfortable. And even, when he tells like fables, like Indian fables and stuff, it's about, like I remember one of the stories is that the guy goes, well, it's just like throwing away an old suit. You wouldn't be upset if I sold the car that doesn't work anymore, is what the Indian guy, and it's like, so don't be upset. I'm not going anywhere. And so I think those kind of messages are really positive, and we really need to hear them because they do give us a little bit of comfort when it comes to that. Now, the fact that he also talked a lot about his channeling friend Emmanuel.
Oh, channeling.
And that was one of the things, like Emmanuel says, dying is nothing to be afraid of. Or what was the big thing that Emmanuel said? He even has a tale about it, like dying is absolutely safe. That's what Emmanuel says. He goes, dying is absolutely safe. And he says it in an article on the Ram Dass website. He also says it in this lecture
That's
from
funny.
1981. And people asked him, because he did spend a lot of time with this person who channeled this bodiless spirit named Emmanuel. And he just said, Emmanuel has taught me a great many things. He never said that, like, yes, I totally believe in this guy or whatever. Actually, it was a woman at the time who was channeling Emmanuel. She died, and now it's a man that's channeling Emmanuel. But he found a way, I guess, to let go of his attachment to BS. So that he went with. But the thing is, like, so there's questionable things, and there's
Right.
stuff that's good and bad about him.
And you can learn from fools and from sages. And I do think, like, oh my God, channelers just drive me up a wall. But that's hilarious. What is it? Dying is
Absolutely safe. Yeah, dying is
absolutely safe.
Well, you have to hear it in context, though. To be fair, you have to hear it in context because they talk about how we're all constantly dying. Basically, our self is not the ego versus the self being the whole and everybody being one. And it does sound comical on its own, but if you hear it like within the context of the message,
I
full
think
message,
it's a great message.
it's not quite as ridiculous.
And I just think that's like funny for marketing.
But I think Emmanuel too. When I was doing research for the episode, I was looking for something that Emmanuel said that was totally stupid, like just kind of to blow it up, Like Emmanuel said, like, in 2014, we're going to have a great war across how they have apocalyptic messages and everything. But Emmanuel is mostly just that kind of new agey comfort talk. And in a time where a lot of things are negative or people decide to focus on the negative, it's good to have a little bit of some of that feel good kind of crap. And it does drive me a little nuts. And there's still a piece of me on the inside that's like, you guys. But also, I understand. I have a 3-year-old, so I watch Disney movies now. So I've probably softened up a little bit in my old age where I appreciate happy endings. And I hope that Ram Dass, wherever he is now, or whatever plane of the existence he has evolved to, is having a happy ending. And if he wants to send us any psychic messages, that would be great.
I agree. He could haunt me at any time.
Okay, so I'm going to next time I meditate, and I try to meditate at least a few times a week. Next time I meditate, I'm looking for a message from Ram Dass. And if he channels through me, I'll let you guys know what happens.
Ram Dass dedicated a huge part of his time here on Earth exploring spirituality and sharing his findings with the Western population. Keeping with the theme of looking inward, this week's song is something that might go well with a relaxation or meditation session. Hopefully you can listen to it while finding a little bit of peace in your own world. Here's an original Sunspot song inspired by Ram Dass's popular book of the same name, Be Here Now.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find us online at othersidepodcast.com. Until next time, see you on the other side.
Man, and did we have a good time talking to our Patreons on January 2nd, or was it just me, Wendy?
No, that was a blast. Always is. It always is. It was nice to catch up with everybody and hear about how the holidays went and kick off the new year as we do, talking about weird stuff. And we got some good suggestions for things to watch before the next Patreon hangout. So make sure you check in on the Facebook group for that if you're in the group.
If you're not in the Facebook See You on the Other Side group, you should get it. And that's othersidepodcast.com/donate is where you can share articles, you can make jokes, you can suggest episodes, you can talk about your favorite guests, you can suggest questions.
That's right.
For guests coming up.
Yeah.
And if you're not, well, then you just SOL.
Aww.
I know, it makes me want to cry. But who makes me want to shout? Our awesome Patreons, just like Dr. Ned. Dr. Ned contributes at the Patreon level where he gets a shout out in every single episode. Doc, you the bomb, yo.
Thanks, Doc. And Happy New Year to you.
And Happy New Year to all of our Patreons. You guys are great. We depend on you for the support, and we appreciate it incredibly. Now, if you freeloaders would like to join up, you can check that out at othersidepodcast.com/donate. Come onto the Facebook group and hang out with us on Skype, and we would love to have you and get your feedback on how we can see more of you on the other side.
Thanks for listening, and have a great week.
I wish this was an olfactory podcast.
No. So
Nosecast.